Hello friends, welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we completed the Fire Temple, which I knew would be a bit of a divisive subject. I don't quite have the same expectations for today's video. This time, we're looking at the Water Temple, which ranks squarely at the bottom for me. This is my least favorite dungeon in the game. However, before we get into that, I have to issue a spoiler warning as usual. Over the course of this video series, nothing is off the table for discussion as long as I feel it relates to the dungeons. So if you want to avoid spoilers, go ahead and save this video to your watch later list and come back after having at least beaten the dungeon featured here. With that out of the way, let's hop right into it. As with the last two dungeons, I made sure to consider the game's intended dungeon order and where the Water Temple falls into that. Technically, you can do these dungeons in any order you'd like, but the game still does imply an order, as I've already talked about in the last two videos. And just as before, I ran a poll. This time I asked which dungeon players had done third, and the results were pretty well what I anticipated. With 776 votes split between 5 options, 45% said that they visited the Water Temple third. Again, the results are not as drastic as with the Wind Temple being the first dungeon, but they are pretty well in line with the results of the Fire Temple poll. Nearly half of the players that voted chose this dungeon third, and from what I can find, these line up mostly with the same reasons as why the Fire Temple was second for nearly the same amount of people. The placement of the regional crisis on the map, Pura's suggestion of where to head next, and the visibility of the regional phenomena itself all play their parts. This is something I've already covered twice now, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much in this video, aside from saying that this really feels to be the intended third dungeon. With that said, let's look at the pre-dungeon stuff to do leading up to the Water Temple. Our approach towards Zora's domain will prey on our expectations. If you played Breath of the Wild, this stretch of path that winds around Zora's River will be very familiar to you. However, the main road is all but destroyed, and a nearby tower and stretch of scaffolding will encourage us to approach the domain from the north side this time. This is the same familiar but fresh feeling as what I talked about with the new roads leading up Death Mountain last time. While it is feasible to take the old route, you're pulled in this direction instead by points of interest. Most notably the tower, of course. The regional crisis here is the constant downpour of sludge that is sullying the waters around Zora's domain. As it turns out, the sludge is caused by an imposter who is disguised as Mario, and so we have to use the new flood device to— wait, hold on. Jokes aside, I actually do really like the lead up to this dungeon, reconnecting with Sidon at the new Mipha Court, which is in the same area where we previously challenged what was many players' first ever Lionel in Breath of the Wild, and running this little investigation into these ancient Zora ruins and manuscripts, finding the pristine sanctum. It's all pretty fun to do. I absolutely adore the ancient Zora architecture. It takes me right back to the Lakebed Temple of Twilight Princess, and it's just really pleasant. This puzzle using King Dorephan's scale is really nice too. Something about reading a little riddle and finding exactly the right perspective to look at these floating ruins and see the correct arrangement of debris. It's all really clever. Then we're teaming up with Sidon again to battle the Sludge-like, a smaller mid-boss, just like we got with Moregia, but a little more memorable. It's not at all difficult, but that is okay. It feels like a mini sort of tutorial for how to use Sidon's powers, almost like a little teaser before the actual dungeon boss itself. But the absolute best part of all this dungeon lead up is what comes next. Sidon will open this whirlpool up for you, which reveals the entrance to the ancient Zora waterworks. I adore this place. That ancient Zora architecture really shines here, and the overall atmosphere feels sacred in a way that I don't find many other places in the game do. That is also in large part due to the music here. There's this feeling like the song is echoing down the halls and pipes of this place. It's beautifully done. It's one of my favorite tracks in the game. My biggest complaint with this place is that it feels like such a tease. The first time I set foot in here during my first playthrough, I really thought I had stepped into the next dungeon. It feels that way. We're led down an entryway that teaches us this water level changing mechanic before reaching a large central room that puts that same mechanic to use. There are little alcoves and tunnels leading in and out of said central room. I was thrilled, genuinely excited at what sort of great puzzles awaited me here in this incredibly atmospheric place. But then, this is it. We unblock the pipes, raise the water, reach this platform, activate the terminal, and then we're done. This is not the dungeon, and it makes the actual dungeon even more disappointing. The ancient Zora waterworks are bursting with untapped potential. I want to take my time, explore this place, and soak in its history. I'm pulled in and enthralled by its atmosphere and what its floor plan implies, but then it just ends. We'll touch back on this area a bit in the conclusion section of the video, but I'd like you to please keep what I've just said in mind. Once we've activated this and opened this waterfall, we can finally head not into the dungeon. The Wellspring Islands are a series of sky islands leading up to the dungeon, just like the Rising Chain Islands during the Wind Temple's approach. A similar thing is done here, and it is actually pretty good stuff. There are plenty of baddies, secrets to find, and puzzles to solve in order to go from one island to the next. They teach you mechanics such as operating within the low gravity, using these bubbles and swimming up the waterfalls, and then they build upon and put new twists on it. This is good stuff. Adding all of this up between the battles, the waterworks, and these sky islands, this is almost the strongest dungeon lead up in the game. I think the Wind Temple approach just barely nudges out on top with its raw and awesome atmosphere, just giving it that much of an edge. But this is still a lot of fun to do. With that said, once we've reached this massive waterfall and met up with Sidon again, we can swim up towards the actual dungeon. Welcome to the Water Temple, also known as the Great Wellspring of Hyrule. Why is it called that? I don't know. I've called the naming conventions of these dungeons into question a few times now, and this is the one where I'm most willing to concede to its status as a temple, so far at least. As for being a wellspring, that implies that it is Hyrule's water source, which I'm simply not buying. This place feels too artificial, too man-made, or Zora-made, I guess. And while it is likely that it existed on the surface once, it doesn't feel right to say it was ever the water source, unless they built some kind of stone shell around the actual water source, but then separating it from the ground and raising it skyward should make it so that the water eventually dries up in theory, yet it doesn't. The water coming from these structures is seemingly infinite, which implies something either magical or artificial, like the Zonai hydrants. I'm not sure what else it could be. That makes the most sense to me. So yeah, Water Temple is actually a temple, I guess. The stage of the amphitheater, if you will, being a place where ceremonies or things like that were conducted. That makes some sense. That aside, I'd like to start off by talking about the positives of the dungeon before I get into my heavier criticisms. So first off, the vibe. As previously mentioned, I adore the style of this ancient Zora architecture. The stonework is downright beautiful. While I do wish that it had a little something extra to help distinguish it from all the pre-dungeon locations that use the same architectural style, I'm not sure I'd dock points for this specifically. Truth be told, I really enjoyed just gathering footage for this video because of just how nice the scenery was here. The music is also once again really great. There's a magical quality to it. As usual, it builds upon itself as we make progress, starting out with a slower piece. It's a small point, but it feels like that very first note is meant to signal a natural transition from the usual Sky Island theme into this dungeon's theme. The choir voices and gentle piano give this place a feeling of both mystery and tranquility. That really resonates with me. The next phase builds on all of this with a feeling that is a little mysterious and a little more sacred and bold. Phase 3 of the song is my favorite of the bunch. Things start feeling more dramatic, bolder, but still playful with a sense of curiosity as these bells and strings rise and fall. It's just gorgeous. Phase 4, meanwhile, amps things up even more. The mystique is dropped for tension, as the track incorporates the Attack on Varuta theme from Breath of the Wild. This section really gives the feeling like you're building towards things, with lots of flourishes. It's great. And finally, Phase 5 drops it all, keeping only a small string layer and those reversed vocals, keeping us on edge. Overall, the music in this dungeon is simply wonderful, just as you'd expect. They blend and flow together and nail that somber but serene, playful but mysterious atmosphere perfectly. Actually playing through the dungeon is a different story. I mentioned during my Fire Temple video that every playthrough of that dungeon had me leaving appreciating it more. As for the Water Temple, I can't really say that is the case. I am now on my 3rd save file, and every time I play through this dungeon, it only reaffirms my initial instincts about it. This dungeon is, simply put, an underwhelming experience. It does very little, it is very small, and it just isn't very interesting to navigate. Couple that with the fact that Sidon's ability is the least useful and least mechanically interesting ability in the game, and you don't have a very good foundation to build your dungeon upon. And hey, isn't it interesting that this is the only dungeon in which it is Link activating the terminals using Sidon's power rather than directing the sages to activate the terminals themselves? As much as we love this big hunky himbo, he just can't get past the allegations of not being at all useful as a sage. Heck, there's only one puzzle in this entire dungeon that actually makes use of his core sage ability. Otherwise, hydrants and splash fruit are more convenient and just as effective for clearing out sludge. Man, you know it's bad when your special sage power can be replaced by throwing a piece of fruit. And that puzzle that makes use of the shielding part of his power can also be bypassed with a certain armor set bonus anyways. The dungeon itself only consists of 2 floors, though the basement floor is a single interior room just below the central room, so it may as well be a single floor. It could branch out in another direction or extend behind here. It would make no difference. And speaking of the central room, can I actually call these rooms? They're all exterior sections, so they're more like platforms, sections, areas. Is the central room more like a plaza then? Does it even matter? The rest of the dungeon forms a perimeter around that aforementioned central not room. There are 4, rather than 5, terminals to activate this time, which are spread around said perimeter, except for that one in the basement room, which is actually a room. Each of these terminals are locked behind a very easy puzzle, which is made even more underwhelmingly simple by the fact that there is no navigational challenge to be had whatsoever. Link is so mobile and versatile when it comes to just getting around in this game that there is pretty well nothing to stop you from reaching any of your objectives, which, may I just remind you, are marked on your map right from the start. So it's not like there is any trying to figure out where to start, where to go, or how to get there. There's no sense of, oh, there's a ledge out of reach, I wonder how to reach it. There's just the ledge, and you can reach it. In my previous 2 videos, I talked extensively about what I've called the cheese factor, that being the ability to bypass or circumvent the game's intended design with often unintended and easier methods. As for the water temple, there is no cheese factor to have to worry about or design around. Why no cheese? Because there's nothing to cheese. Nothing standing in your way. Nothing you have to cheese around. You just go to the places marked on your map unimpeded. To better illustrate my point, let's review the dungeon progression in detail. In no particular order, the dungeon's puzzles and objectives go like this. Use a bubble to bring this orb from this island to the next one over. Drain the water so that the orb goes into this slot, which opens the gate, and activate the terminal. Use bullet time to hit the switch in this rotating section of the tower to drain this water and activate the terminal. Build yourself a water wheel and complete this circuit to open this gate and activate the terminal. And finally, head down into the basement room using either the Flamebreaker armor set bonus or Sidon's bubble in order to get past the flames, retrieve and bring this orb back, fit it into this slot, which opens the gate so you can activate the terminal. Boom, done, cue boss fight. That is it. Some of these puzzles sound pretty cool on paper, actually, but in practice they're made so painfully obvious and easy by the materials that the game provides you with that they end up simply feeling more like chores than puzzles. When you're given a bunch of hoverstones, you don't get to have that aha moment of figuring out how to get this orb from this end of the room over the spikes and into the slot. You're just going to use the hoverstones that they gave you. When they give you these stone slabs right next to the water wheel, you're not going to have to think about how to get this spinning. You're going to use the stone slabs. As I mentioned near the start of this video, the game pushes you to go into this dungeon third. That is the implied dungeon order, that you've already done the Wind and Fire Temple. So why is this dungeon so painfully easy? I will give them that there are plenty of enemies here, with new ones spawning as each terminal is activated, which is a good thing. I do wish, however, that they weren't all just constructs and choo-choos. The Wind Temple had both better enemy variety and level design. The Fire Temple lacked in enemy variety, but at least the layout was a beast to tackle in and of itself. This dungeon has neither. The constructs scale up in difficulty, early, so if you come here later, you'll be fighting higher level enemies, okay, but padding the dungeon out with more enemies is not enough to redeem it for being mostly uninteresting. Don't get me wrong, we should absolutely have this many enemies here. It's just that those enemies are basically the only form of substance that the dungeon has to offer. I want more from the puzzles and navigation. Actually, now that I'm writing this, I am realizing that the layout here bears something of a resemblance, in broad strokes, to the final trial, the DLC dungeon from Breath of the Wild, with its large central area, 4 terminals to activate in branching rooms, and enemies that spawn in the center of the dungeon after each terminal gets activated. Though despite having such segmented sections, at least that dungeon had some neat puzzles to work through, including some that we had to do to even open up those side areas. There were obstacles to overcome and have that aha moment that I love so much. That isn't the case here in the water temple. Riding up in this bubble is not a puzzle. Jumping over here is not a puzzle. There's never a sense of wondering where you should go or having to figure out how to get there. That is what makes this dungeon so much of a disappointment. With all of that said, once all 4 terminals are activated, and by extension all 4 faucets are turned on, yes, really, we can confront the dungeon boss. Pouring the water will reveal the dungeon boss, the source of the sludge polluting Zora's domain. This is Muktorok. I just can't take this guy seriously. Visually speaking, I guess Muktorok does bear some passing resemblance to an Octorok, and he spits sludge around. I get it. I think Sludge-like looked cooler, far more menacing with those big teeth. Muktorok? He's just a goofy little guy. However, he does have this ability to summon this giant sludge shark, which looks way cooler. I remember seeing glimpses of this boss in the trailer and thinking that Georg from Majora's Mask was making a return. Let's bring back George the fish. In fact, I would say that this boss would be cooler if either the sludge-like was the core of the beast instead of Muktorok, or if it was just the shark part. The music in this fight is such a weird, zany, frantic piece. I'll be honest, I don't care for it. Maybe it's my distaste for the boss itself, but hear me out. The vibe of this piece, its tone, calls to mind for me the frantic nature of the Majora's Incarnation boss music from Majora's Mask. Just listen to them side by side. This works well for that boss. It is thematic and includes leitmotifs that have been sprinkled throughout the entirety of that game. And Majora is just off his rocker. It feels earned in a way that this boss doesn't. Muktorok isn't as menacing as Majora, so instead of the weird circus clown show being unsettling and creepy, it's just kind of annoying instead. Muktorok himself is speedy, jumping around the stage and spewing sludge everywhere to slow you down. In theory, this works, but like the music, it all ends up being just annoying in a way. I get what they were going for, but this guy just isn't fun to fight. While in theory, Sidon's ability is going to be far more useful in this battle than it was during the rest of the dungeon, there are actually a bunch of other ways to do this fight without him. You can build a hydrant car, or use a magic rod with an opal fuse, and these are arguably more effective since you don't have the cooldown time that comes with Sidon's ability, or you can use Splash Fruit. So yeah, Muktorok gets a big thumbs down from me. As much as I like to look at design and mechanics, at the end of it all, I always have to ask myself, is it fun? And to be honest, no, not this time. I don't find this boss fight to be fun at all. It all ends up being more of a nuisance than anything else in the end. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container. As usual, Sidon gets his secret stone, and you'll never guess what sort of exposition comes next. So that's the dungeon. Overall, the water temple can pretty well be summed up as underwhelming. The visuals, the architecture, the music, even the low gravity mechanic is all quite wonderful. However, it is all offset by a layout that is too simple to navigate. If my complaints about the lack of locked doors in previous dungeons wasn't enough, there are hardly even walls here, let alone doors, let alone locked doors. There is hardly even anything here. I like the puzzles, conceptually. Using the low gravity to hold bullet time for extended periods to hit this switch is a neat idea, and I'm always a sucker for these games working in circuit puzzles, but they telegraph these to you far too heavily for my taste. I never have that moment of having to stop and think about things in this dungeon. Frankly, the entire lead up to the dungeon is far more interesting than anything that actually happens inside the dungeon itself. So the question becomes, how do we fix it? How do we improve the water temple? Well, hear me out. What I would suggest is we take the overall structure of the dungeon, the central area and its surrounding segments, build walls around each of these islands to make them rooms, and bring them underground. Combine them with the ancient Zora waterworks. That should have been the dungeon to begin with. So we take these puzzles and we don't set the dungeon in the sky. We instead expand upon this underground area. It already has the skeleton of a dungeon in place. Instead of the central terminal down here simply activating this waterfall, make it a master control switch that changes the water level of this central room. Place the boss arena as an upstairs room to that, and the rest of these formerly islands now rooms around it, branching off from these pipes and waterways, making it so that we have to control the water flow and levels to reach different rooms. Then, navigation itself can play a significant role in how we approach the dungeon. And yes, my proposed fix is to basically turn this into Ocarina of Time's water temple. I realize that. But this could present a good opportunity to make use of Sidon's innate Zora swimming ability, which outside of a cutscene doesn't really get put to use in this game like it did in Breath of the Wild. Besides, let's be honest, for a water temple, there isn't a lot of water here. It could be called a sky temple, or a faucet temple, or even a gravity temple, but I feel very strongly about this. The waterworks should have been the dungeon, and the mysterious atmosphere and wonderful architecture could have had an even better chance to shine. Plus, we would have the slickness of the walls and Link's lack of underwater swimming to impede our progress if need be, so that we can't cheese everything. There is serious untapped potential here in the waterworks, and that gets squandered for what? A handful of samey sky islands with no sense of challenge to them? If we are really set on keeping these separate and having the dungeon up here in the sky, then here's a few other ideas I'll float by you. Just like I suggested with Yunobo, let's take away Sidon's ability to teleport to and magically catch up to the player. There's only one instance where he can't do that. That's getting past that fire barrier. But otherwise, he's able to just blip over to you like Yunobo could. I don't like that. It made sense for Tulin, he can fly, and I guess you could argue that he's jumping in low gravity, and that is how he does it, but it just doesn't feel right to me. I think they could have kept the dungeon as open as it is if he couldn't reach these side areas without us having to make a path for him, even if it were activating these waterfalls for him to swim up, or bringing bubbles over to him or something. It's not my ideal fix though. I think that simple proposed switch up worked for the fire temple, but here it feels like the problems run too deep and are too ingrained in the layout not being that interesting. So my earlier proposal of using the waterworks, I think would make for a far more engaging dungeon. But alas, in the end, we're stuck with this version of the Water Temple. It is my least favorite dungeon in the game, and it's not even close. It is by a very wide margin. In what I feel is otherwise a fantastic game, this is an unfortunate low point. this was tiring. I don't like complaining so much. I find it emotionally draining to be this negative. But I'm not going to be dishonest with you guys about how I feel. So this was my most critical video to date, I'm sure. Regardless, I appreciate you all sitting through it and hearing me out. I'd like to take a quick moment here to thank you for watching this video. And special thanks goes to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. You guys make this all possible. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight, Naomi, Bunny, and Stefan, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye. Hey, since you made it to the very end of the video, here's a bonus tidbit for you. Initially in my script, I had written that the Ancient Zora Waterworks theme was a reinterpretation of Mipha's theme. And then I was editing and I was like, it's totally not. So I went and listened to a lot of Zelda music and asked around a bit online, and strangely enough, it isn't a theme from Breath of the Wild at all. It's the Faron Woods theme from Skyward Sword, of all things. Here, if we slow down the Faron Woods theme and play it side by side to the Ancient Zora Waterworks theme, you can hear the similarities. And it shines through even more if you listen to the flooded Faron Woods theme next to the Zora Waterworks theme. So there you go. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. And there's your bonus tidbit.